Hello dear students. In continuation with our series on cardiology, today we will be looking at the jugular venous pressure or the JVP. Okay, so let's begin. So what is this JVP? So what is exactly a JVP? JVP, it basically refers to the pressure changes which are denoted in the jugular vein. Which jugular vein we take? In the internal jugular vein. So what is the significance of this JVP? What are we going to find out using this JVP? So, the pressure changes that happen in the internal jugular vein are reflections of the activity that happens in the right side of the heart, right? So, the cardiac cycle changes that happen in the right atrium and the right ventricle and the pressure changes that happen there are reflected onto the internal jugular vein. So, this is what we call as the jugular venous pressure, right? So, the pressure changes which are seen in the internal jugular vein. So, if you look at this diagram, can you see that this is the clavicle? So, this is your clavicle, this is your sternal angle, and can you see the heart here? We have the RA and the RV, and the RA is in line with the internal jugular vein. So, it becomes very simple for you to understand that we do not look at the external jugular vein for the JVP because the external jugular vein is within the muscle layers and it is not in direct continuity with the right atrium. So, what we look at is at the internal jugular vein. So, this brings us to the second question. How do we measure the jugular venous pressure? So, what is the position of the patient? As you can see here, the position of the patient is in a semi-recumbent position. Semi-recumbent position, right? The patient is positioned at an angle of 45 degree. But this was according to convention. The latest edition of Harrison says that 30 degree is the position at which we look for the jugular venous pressure, right? So, we look at the patient at an angle of 30 degree, and as you can see here, he has turned his neck to one side. And the light source, this is your light source, the light should be at a tangential angle. So, you shine the torch at an tangential angle, okay, and that is when you look for the JVP pulsations. Fine. So, why or what is the importance of the position of the patient? Let us understand that and then we will move forward to how do you localize the JVP and what is the method that is used. So, whenever the patient is like this, the JVP column, suppose it is here. Now, if the patient is at 90 degrees, the JVP column drops. And when the patient is lying down completely, the JVP column rises, and in fact it rises and in turn goes even intracranially. That is the reason why we look at the JVP at a level where it is just seen at the level of the semi-recumbent position or the 45 degree angle. Where is the location? Where is this JVP pulsation located? As you can see here, this is located in the medial end of the clavicle or medial end of the clavicle, just above the clavicle, between the two heads of the sternocleidomastoid. Right, at the medial end of the clavicle, between the two heads of the sternocleidomastoid is where you will be seeing the jugular venous pressure. So, in a normal individual, the pulsations will be just seen. Okay. Now, what is the method which is employed for measuring the JVP? So, your patient is like this, right? Now, this is your sternal angle, this is your clavicle. So, your patient is in a semi-recumbent position, this is your sternal angle and this is your clavicle, and you use two scales. The first scale is placed perpendicular to the sternal angle and the second scale is placed parallel to the ground. Okay. So, let me just demonstrate it here. So, the first scale is present, suppose the patient is standing this side in a semi-recumbent position, the first scale is placed on the sternal angle perpendicular and the second scale is placed like this like this, which is parallel to the ground. And the measurement that you get here is given in terms of centimeter of water. The measurement that you get in your perpendicular scale is given in terms of the centimeter of water. What is the normal JVP? It is less than 4 centimeters of water. Now, how do you measure the right atrial pressure from this? Whatever reading you get on your JVP plus 5 centimeters of water. So, whatever reading you get on the JVP plus 5 centimeters of water is what gives us the right atrial pressure, right? So, can you see here, you place a scale this way, you place it perpendicular and the other scale is placed parallel. And if the JVP pulsation is here, this is how you measure the jugular venous pressure. Fine. So, this is the two scale method which is used for the measurement of the jugular venous pressure. Okay. Now, we will look at how do you know whether this is a jugular venous pressure or an arterial pulse. Because we know that the carotid artery also is very close to the jugular venous pressure. So, how do you know whether this is a JVP or an arterial pulse? So, JVP is basically a venous pulsation which has two waves and it usually has two negative waves. Arterial pulse or carotid pulse is a single positive outward deflection. JVP is better seen. Arterial waveform is better felt. So, JVP is better seen and the arterial waveform is better felt. Apart from this, where is the location of the JVP? It is located in the right internal jugular vein and it is seen in between the two heads of the sternocleidomastoid, whereas an arterial waveform is lateral to the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay. JVP changes the column of blood which is present in the jugular vein. It can be affected by respiration. Carotid pulse is not affected by respiration. So, these are some of the ways in which you can differentiate the jugular venous pressure from the arterial waveform. Okay. So, we have understood some basics. We have understood what is the JVP, how do we measure the JVP and how do you differentiate the jugular venous pressure from the arterial waveform. Alright. Now, let us look at the JVP waveforms. So, when you look at the waveforms at the outset, it looks very difficult, but if you just understand the cardiac cycle and what are the events that are taking place, you will easily understand what are the waveforms and how they are generated. Okay. Now, this is basically a schematic diagram. We are just looking at the RA and the RV, right? So, this is the RA, this is the RV and this is your tricuspid valve. So, we look at the various events which are happening in the right side of the heart and how it is transmitted to the JVP. So, let us look at the first event. So, the first event that is happening here, you can see that the blood is flowing from the RA to the RV. It has already flown. That means that you are somewhere at the end of diastole. As we all recollect from the events which happen in the cardiac cycle, towards the end of diastole, what will you see? You will see that there is something called as the atrial kick effect. Right? What you see is the atrial kick. So, what happens here is that the atrium contracts so that whatever amount of little blood which is left behind is also emptied from the RA to the RV. So, when the atrium contracts, don't you feel that the pressure wave will be transmitted to the JVP and it appears as the first positive wave, which is nothing but your A wave, right? So, what is the A wave due to? The A wave is due to atrial contraction or the atrial systole. Okay, fine. Now, let us look at what happens in the next portion. When the next portion, once the diastole has finished, which stage do we go into? We go into the stage of isovolumetric contraction, right? So, in the phase of isovolumetric contraction, you know that the tricuspid valve is closed and this is your pulmonary valves, they are also closed. Okay. So, the blood fills in the RV? As the blood fills in the RV, the tricuspid valve is pushed upwards into the RA. So once it is pushed upwards, don't you think that there will be a small pressure upward stroke which will be reflected in the JVP? So this is what is called as a second wave, which is the C wave. Okay. Following the isovolumetric contraction, what happens is that the pulmonary valves open and the blood begins to flow. Correct? So this is nothing but the beginning of your systole. Once there is the beginning of your systole and the blood empties, as the blood goes on decreasing, can you see here the blood goes on decreasing, what happens? The tricuspid valve will definitely move downwards. Correct? The tricuspid valve, which was here, will start moving downwards, right? So there is a small dip of the tricuspid valve towards the right ventricle, and this results in a decreased pressure. So the pressure drops, the pressure decreases, and this is what we see as a descent in the JVP, and this is what we call as the X descent. Okay. So what is the X descent due to? X descent is basically due to atrial relaxation, right? So when the tricuspid valve moves downward into the RV and the systole is happening, this also means that the atria is in diastole or the atria is relaxing so that it can start receiving the blood from the systemic circulation, right? So the X descent is because of the atrial relaxation. So just remember that the A wave is because of atrial contraction and the X descent is because of the atrial relaxation. Followed by which you can see that the pulmonary valves also close and there is flow of blood into the RA. There is flow of blood into the RA. So as there is flow of blood into the RA, there will be an increased pressure. Naturally, as the blood flow increases, the pressure increases, and this is what results in your next wave, which occurs due to atrial filling, which generates the next positive wave, which is called as the V wave. Okay, this is what is called as the V wave. When the tricuspid valve opens and the RA again starts filling into the RV, this is what we call as the Y descent because of atrial emptying. Okay, so you just have to remember A wave is atrial contraction, X descent atrial relaxation, V wave atrial filling, and Y wave atrial emptying. So this has to be etched in your mind so that every further interpretation of the JVP becomes much more easier. Okay, so I hope this is very clear. Now, which is the systole? Which is the systole? So this entire area, which includes the X descent and the upstroke, which is the V wave, is what represents the systole. Okay, till here clear? Fine. Now, how do we identify the waveforms? The A wave is associated with the first heart sound, right? Now, how do we identify the X wave? X wave happens just before the second heart sound, and the Y wave happens just after the second heart sound, right? So the A wave is the one which is synchronous with the apex, or it occurs in synchrony with the first heart sound, and the X wave is just before S2 and the Y wave is just after S2. Now let us look at the various abnormalities. We have understood how each of these forms. Let us look at various abnormalities. So when do you get an absent A wave? When do you get an absent A wave? When the atria is not contracting. We know that the A wave is because of the atrial kick or the atrial contraction. When will the atria not contract? When there is chaotic or disorganized electrical activity in the atria, right? So this is seen in atrial fibrillation. So this is seen in atrial fibrillation. Alright, where will you get large A waves or giant A waves? When will you get large or giant A waves? Whenever the atria is contracting against the ventricle and the ventricle is at a high pressure. So the high pressure will in turn cause an increase in the amplitude of the A wave because the atria is contracting against a high pressure ventricle. So where do you get a high pressure in the RV? You can get it in right ventricular hypertrophy. You can get it in pulmonary stenosis because this is where the pulmonary valve is. If the pulmonary valve is stenosed, the pressure will again be back reflected into the RV and in the RA and then the giant AVP and the giant A waves in the JV. So we have the right ventricular hypertrophy, pulmonary stenosis, pulmonary hypertension. So these are the conditions where you can get a giant A wave. What do you mean by cannon A waves? Cannon A waves occurs when the atrium contracts against a closed tricuspid valve. So if the atrium contracts against a closed tricuspid valve, you can get a cannon wave in the JVP. When does that happen? That means that the atria and ventricle are not contracting synchronously and it is seen in a complete heart block. So this is basically seen in complete heart block. So we have seen the various abnormalities of A wave and I hope you have understood till here. Now let us look at the X wave. Now what is the X wave due to? The X wave is due to atrial relaxation. Fine. The X wave is due to atrial relaxation. When will you get a prominent X descent? When the atria is unable to relax? When will the atria be unable to relax? That happens especially when there is some amount of fluid and there is some amount of impedance to the filling, right? So prominent X descent is seen in cardiac tamponade, constrictive pericarditis, okay? So that is when you get a prominent X descent. Where do you get an absent X descent? Right? So you will have to remember tricuspid regurgitation. So what happens in tricuspid regurgitation is that the blood flows back into the right atrium. So when the blood flows back into the right atrium from the RV, the tricuspid valve is incompetent. What happens? Will the atria be able to relax? No, because when the atria begins its relaxation, there is already blood. So will there be an X wave? No, there will be no X wave. Okay. So now we have learned about the A waves and the X wave. Now let us move on to prominent V wave. Prominent V wave. So just remember your magic word for V wave. V wave is because of atrial filling. So when will you get a prominent V wave? When there is some amount of blood which is already there in the RA. In addition to the amount of blood which is there in the RA, there is filling of the blood as well. So when do you see that there is more blood in the RA? This happens in tricuspid regurgitation again, and this prominent V wave is so prominent that it can combine with the C wave and we get what is called as a CV wave, and this is what we call as the Lanz-Sissy sign, right? So this prominent CV wave which is seen in tricuspid regurgitation is what we call as the Lanz-Sissy sign. Alright, so now we have understood the A wave, the X descent, V wave. Now, what is the Y descent due to? Y descent is due to atrial emptying. Okay, so where do you get a rapid Y descent? Rapid Y descent is also called as Friedrich's sign. So where do you get this rapid Y descent? Rapid Y descent happens in a condition called constrictive pericarditis. So rapid Y descent is seen in a condition called as constrictive pericarditis. So what is this constrictive pericarditis? It's a condition where there is thickening of the pericardium. So there is thickening of the pericardium. Because of what? Because of malignancies which infiltrate the pericardium. It can be because of tuberculosis. So the pericardium becomes rock-like. Okay, the pericardium becomes rock-like. So when the pericardium becomes rock-like, let us say that this is the pericardium and this is the RV. The RV begins to dilate as the blood flows from the RA to the RV. That is what we are looking at. We are looking at the Y wave in the JVP. Now as it dilates and suddenly it goes and hits this rock-like pericardium such that it cannot dilate further. Okay, this is what happens in constrictive pericarditis. If it cannot dilate further, what happens? The initial portion of the Y wave becomes very prominent and later portion is lost. So this is what results in the prominent Y wave which is seen in constrictive pericarditis. Okay, so that is about your prominent Y wave in constrictive pericarditis. Okay, so we have learned what is the JVP, how do we measure it, and how each of the waves are formed, and what are the various pathological abnormalities that you can see. A very important and frequently tested area is how do you differentiate the JVP findings between the cardiac tamponade and constrictive pericarditis. Okay, now both the conditions are diseases of the pericardium. As I had mentioned, cardiac tamponade is basically because of fluid which accumulates in the pericardial cavity surrounding the heart. And then this fluid will basically cause compression of the heart. So this is what is your cardiac tamponade. Constrictive pericarditis, on the other hand, is because of some infiltrative process such as tuberculosis or malignancy, the pericardium becomes thick and rock-like, as you can see here. So this is again further going to impediment the blood flow. So the JVP changes are slightly different in constrictive pericarditis and tamponade. Most importantly, you have to see the difference in the Y wave. The magic word that you have to remember regarding the Y wave is that the Y wave is because of atrial emptying, right? So any impediment to atrial emptying is what affects the Y wave. So how is it different in cardiac tamponade and constrictive pericarditis? In cardiac tamponade, what happens is that there is a uniform obstruction, right? So which phase is affected? So there is a uniform impediment to diastole, right? So there is a uniform effect on the heart because the fluid presses on the heart and this pressing is basically uniform and there is an impairment in the diastole. So if there is an impairment in the diastole, what happens? The RA-RV cannot relax. If the RV cannot relax, what happens? The pressure in the RA and RV becomes equal. So the pressure in the RA and RV becomes equal during diastole. If the pressure in the RA and RV are equal, do you think there will be any blood flow? No, because you need a pressure gradient for the blood to flow. So if there is no pressure gradient, because of the uniform impediment to the RA-RV relaxation, then will you have a Y wave? No. So you will have an absent Y wave. So the Y wave is absent. Okay. Now how does it differ from constrictive pericarditis? We had just learned that in constrictive pericarditis, the pericardium becomes rock-like, right? So when this is your pericardium, this is your RV. When the blood flows from the RA to the RV dilates up to a point where it goes and hits this rock-like pericardium and it stops. So what does that mean? That means that the initial portion of the filling during diastole is increased and there is a rapid Y descent. Okay, that is a very crucial difference that you have to know between cardiac tamponade and constrictive pericarditis, right? So there is a rapid Y descent. Okay, so this uniform impediment to filling is not there. Okay, now what is this Kusumol sign? So normally in the jugular venous pressure, as we had mentioned before, jugular venous pressure varies according to inspiration and expiration. So when you inspire, what happens is that there is an increased venous return to the heart and there is an inspiratory fall in the jugular venous pressure. So this is what is normal. Normally there is an inspiratory fall in the jugular venous pressure. If this is absent and the JVP remains elevated during inspiration, this is what we call as the Kusumol sign, right? So what happens to cardiac tamponade and constrictive pericarditis? What happens to this Kusumol sign? Let us look at constrictive pericarditis first. Now we have a rock-like pericardium. Do you think that the thoracic pressures will be transmitted to the heart? So no, it cannot be transmitted because there is a rock-like pericardium. So if the thoracic pressures are not transmitted to the heart, do you think there will be an inspiratory fall in the jugular venous pressure? No, it will not be. Then what happens? It looks like it is elevated, correct? So the Kussmaul sign is positive in constrictive pericarditis because the pressures are not transmitted, whereas it is negative in cardiac tamponade. So Kussmaul sign is absent in cardiac tamponade because the pressures are still transmitted and there can still be a fall in the JVP. Okay. So I hope that you have completely understood what is the difference in the Y wave and what is the difference in Kussmaul sign between cardiac tamponade and constrictive pericarditis. Okay. So this brings us to the end of this session on jugular venous pressure. So we have learned about what is the JVP, how do you measure, how do you identify the waveforms, the various differences in the waveforms, and how do you differentiate between tamponade and constrictive pericarditis on the JVP. Okay. Thank you.